Oh, yeah. Yeah, I go. Sure, I go watch them play. I like to watch Hopkins play lacrosse because they play lacrosse. They play as a team, not as individuals. That's what I like about the Hopkins lacrosse.
Lacrosse at Johns Hopkins is one of the greatest traditions in college sports. It's a game most people don't recognize, but here at Hopkins, they've been playing the game for over a century. What began as a brutal form of Indian warrior training is today a fast-paced, highly physical game played in several countries around the world, including Canada, Australia, England, and Japan. Here in the United States, kids are discovering the sport in cities from Manhasset to Los Angeles. In Baltimore, Maryland, lacrosse is a familiar sight, where youngsters anxiously await lacrosse season as an annual rite of spring. Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore is the shining star of collegiate lacrosse. It has dominated the history of lacrosse like no other collegiate team in any other sport. Over the past 100 years, Hopkins has won 42 collegiate national championships. In fact, one of every 4 members of the Lacrosse Hall of Fame at one time donned the infamous black and blue jerseys of Hopkins.
I think it's a combination of the institution, the philosophy of the institution toward the sport, and all of the people who have made it up for so long, the tradition over the time. There's nothing in this world like tradition, and this place reeks of it. It's awesome. I mean, Homewood Field, black and blue.
So there is this tradition. Some of it is indefinable, but it's there. You can feel it. You can be a part of it. You can just feel it in the air. There's something there that sets this sport apart at this place.
Homewood Field on the north side of campus has been the birthplace of lacrosse miracles over the past century.
Clock is on the field. We're inside a minute to play. Official clock is on the field, not on the scoreboard here at the stadium. Glancy throws it off to Cook. Cook going to the goal. Cook still with possession. Cook shot and a goal! Nice play by the Hopkins defense when Burnett had the open man coming across.
Krummenacher near side. to Scott, to Krummenacher, to Dressel, to the shot.
Oh!
He scored.
Well, the perfect lacrosse game is at Hopkins. I guess I've finally gotten used to seeing the AstroTurf field after years, but Homewood Field is really the home of lacrosse. Lacrosse, of course, was an Indian sport, but for all practical purposes, when you play on Homewood Field and you go to a game at Homewood Field, that's the Yankee Stadium.
Sing praise to dear old Hopkins, hurrah for black and blue. Rah for the black boys, rah for the blue boys, rah for Johnny Hopkins, rah. We'll pour for the praise to dear old John Hopkins, rah for Johnny Hopkins, rah.
All they have to do is sit in that locker room underneath those stands before a game and hear that crowd's noise build up. Take the walk down the hallway and come out and hear the band, hear the announcer say, and ladies and gentlemen, the 1991 or 92 Johns Hopkins Blue Jay lacrosse team, and hear that 11 or 10,000 people stand up and cheer. It gets you so pumped up. It's the biggest high any man in the world could ever have.
This is Homewood Field, home of the Johns Hopkins Blue Jays. Today, we'll take a closer look at the men who have made this hallowed ground the battlefield where lacrosse legends are born.
Planet Logue Films presents the Hopkins Lacrosse Story.
Johns Hopkins University is located on 146 acres here in North Baltimore. Gathered at the university are some of the greatest minds in medicine, science, and research. Boasting the #1 medical school in the country, as well as one of the most respected hospitals in the world, Hopkins' reputation has brought the university international recognition. At a university in which sports is not the central emphasis, lacrosse here is a Division I sport. The school's commitment to the sport and the development of the game have made it the center of lacrosse activity in the United States for over a century.
If you're a fan, it's nice to cheer a winning team. Besides, it's a beautiful game. It's fast, it's graceful, and in the spring, I think lacrosse really sort of marks a change in the spirit of the campus. And you go out there on a Saturday afternoon, and there's this enormous tradition. Everybody is up for it, and you can sort of, it's electric.
But lacrosse is the game people come to watch at Hopkins. And it's always been that way. It's always been that way. Back in my undergraduate days, and it's that way today. It's the dominant sport on this campus.
First of all, he got pulled to the ground with a freaking hold. Oh, give it to him.
Boom, go!
The trademark of Hopkins lacrosse has always been great coaching. Today is no exception, as head coach Tony Seaman spearheads the Blue Jays program. One of the rare Hopkins coaches who did not attend the university, Seaman's coaching experience comes from the University of Pennsylvania, where he compiled an impressive record. Seaman's genuineness and charisma have made him a favorite among his players and coaches. Approachable and honest, Seaman is never shy to share feelings with his players.
We have to do such an incredibly much better job clearing the lacrosse ball. You're not getting a lot of pressure in that middle zone. You don't have to get it upfield. If you are getting pressure, I understand. Try to hit your middies. Keep the bench area clear. The long pole has got to get off the field quicker when we see it's a change of possession, so we can get the guy in at the bench.
It's just something that I guess I would never be able to go to sleep again if I had turned it down, and I'd always wondered, God, I had the opportunity to coach the very best, or at least at a school that wants to be the very best, and that was very hard to turn down.
The coaching staff supporting Seaman includes some of the most experienced minds in the game.
The personification of Hopkins lacrosse to me is smart lacrosse. Hopkins lacrosse also, from a coaching standpoint, is very, very sophisticated. they have a coaching staff at Johns Hopkins that could go on the field and be competitive with some of their players. Some of the best Hopkins All-Americans are on their coaching staff now.
The black, when we're in black, everything we went over is everything they're doing out there. We should not have a problem. I think the last 5 times that we were in black, you threw the ball away. Okay? But if you're playing the ball and you're off the ball, what do you got to do? Get yourself where you should be.
Together, these players and coaches make up the new generation of lacrosse at Hopkins. The bitter irony that faces Hopkins and many top colleges today is that the proliferation of lacrosse programs around the country has greatly improved the level of competition.
Bill Weicker is the man with the ball. Weicker trying to break in past Dressel on and the goal on the rebound, and Virginia takes.
So, you know, we're like the Yankees or the Notre Dame football team, or this is the chance to play the big guy. And if we could be 0-8, and it would be the chance to play the big guy just because of the tradition of Hopkins.
As an opposing player for the University of Maryland, Joe Harlan remembers the feeling of playing against Hopkins.
One of the players spoke to me when we were standing on the sidelines before the Navy game, and I said, wouldn't it be fun to beat Navy and have all our home fans happy with us? He said, no, the best thing in the world is to beat Hopkins at homecoming and watch all their fans walk away mad.
The high level of competition has created heavier emphasis on recruiting. Each year, lacrosse scouts comb the country's high schools in search of the nation's finest student athletes. A coach's ability to attract the best athletes is critical.
The parity in college lacrosse in the last 5 years is just amazing. I think we're finding more and more good athletes in high school playing lacrosse. And that means only so many of them can go to one school. And their abilities start to spread out to many schools. And unfortunately, I'm not trying to make an excuse here for myself, but I just don't think the dominance that Hopkins enjoyed back in the 50s and 60s, and I think it's very evident today in the 80s and the early 90s, is that no one is going to dominate.
One of the problems Hopkins has in being consistently good in the future is the fact there's a lot of competition, not only on the field, but in recruiting. And any coach will tell you that's worth his salt. You can be the greatest coach in the world, but they'd rather have good players. There's only so much you can do with average players. You have good players, and they'll make you a great coach.
You know, preferably I would like to be a racehorse kind of team, but I think that's hard to do if you don't have horses that can run fast. So you have to adjust, and that we're willing to do and will continue to do.
Whether one is for Hopkins or opposed, it's hard to ignore the mystique that surrounds the sport of the school. With pride at stake on both sides, crowds at Homewood are very partisan. Every Saturday afternoon, bragging rights are up for grabs among players, fans, and alumni.
I think the thing that makes Johns Hopkins lacrosse so special is the consistency over the years of the coaching, the support of the alumni, and the support of the fans.
The birthplace of lacrosse tradition is here at Homewood Field, located on the campus along University Parkway. To experience a game here is to share an excitement that's lived here unchanged for over a century.
Hopkins has a very unusual band. Somebody described it to me one time as consisting of a whistle and a comb with tissue paper on it. It's a little bit bigger than that, but it's not the most significant band in the world, but it epitomizes the Hopkins spirit. Small school, tremendous spirit.
Often sounding more like a flock of wounded geese than a practiced musical ensemble, the Hopkins band invokes a strange sense of humorous pride to Hopkins faithful.
Well, the band was there. They played about as well then as they did today. But they were always there, and they always made a lot of noise. And they were always great to have.
Conrad Geblein, for whom the stadium is named, conducted the band rain or shine at games for over 40 years. Hopkins lacrosse has never been at a loss for enthusiastic fans. Thousands of Baltimoreans flock to Homewood in the spring to witness the best lacrosse in the country. The essence of the team comes from alumni who religiously return to Homewood year after year.
It's a small school. It doesn't have anything else that, from a sports standpoint, that really can claim national attention. So we put all of our energies and all of our efforts and everything we have into making this a big sport at a small school.
Lacrosse, or Bagataway, as it was originally called, began with the North American Indians in the 1400s. The Eastern Algonquin and Iroquois Indians played a game that could include hundreds or even thousands of players over enormous areas. The French Canadians adopted the sport, and by the time of the American Civil War, lacrosse was being played on the East Coast. 4,000 Baltimoreans got their first glimpse of the sport in an exhibition game in 1878. Johns Hopkins was founded in 1876. Elgin Gould, a Toronto native, formed the Johns Hopkins Lacrosse Club only 6 years later. Hopkins then was not at Homewood, where it is now, but on Howard Street in the Student Latin Quarter in downtown Baltimore. There were about 100 students enrolled, and the school had only a newly constructed gym for the emerging football and lacrosse teams. The Baltimore Athletic Club played here at Druid Hill Park. They formed the Druid Lacrosse Club and shared their field with Hopkins students eager to learn the game. Hopkins fielded their own team under Clinton L. Riggs and had their first official season in 1888. In the early 1890s, lacrosse in the United States almost died out, but Brance M. Roselle kept the sport alive at Hopkins. Hopkins won its first championship in 1891 with an undefeated season. In that same year, Hopkins pioneered the modern carrying game by eliminating the long Gilman passes that were common. The Hopkins team traveled to Clinton Park by horse-drawn bus, as they had no field of their own. Under Coach Bill Madron, Hopkins introduced what is called the Hopkins system, based on short crisscross passes and preset plays. This was to be Hopkins' greatest contribution to the game. 1898 marked a point of Hopkins' phenomenal rise to college lacrosse supremacy, which converted sedate Baltimore into a seething hotbed of lacrosse enthusiasm. Hopkins won almost every championship in the next 2 decades. One of the early players was Ronald Abercrombie, the peerless center who captained the 1900 team. His use of a shorter stick became the norm for all lacrosse attackmen. But it was William C. Schmeisser who headed the procession of college lacrosse, and for the next 40 years was the father of Hopkins lacrosse. Affectionately known as Father Bill, Schmeisser coached Hopkins till 1910.
Father Bill Schmeisser was a man who gave a good part of his life to lacrosse. And he spent many an afternoon out at Homewood in the spring and even in the winter coaching us on the blackboard when we couldn't go out and play. And he dedicated his life really to Johns Hopkins lacrosse. And he did it for many, many, many years.
Father Bill Schmeisser was looked upon as kind of truly the father of Hopkins lacrosse. He played just after the turn of the century, and then for many years helped coach the team.
Hopkins played its first game at Homewood Field in 1908. The university's move up Howard Street to Homewood campus was complete by 1916. G. Pitts Raleigh had a brief stint as head coach before Rainey Wolf took over the reins. Father Bill remained on the scene as advisory coach. The new field at Homewood was the place to witness a lacrosse match. Tickets were 50 cents. Hopkins freshmen were the object of hazing practices and were required to attend every game. Crowds upwards of 4,000 attended.
Yeah, there was always a pretty good crowd. Always packed the stadium. There was always full, standing room only when we played, you know? Because we were winning. A winning team draws crowds, you know? And I don't care who we played, we always had the place packed. I don't care what it was.
As joyous as the days were, the sounds of war were just around the corner, and life on campus was about to change. As the somber atmosphere of World War I descended on Hopkins, lacrosse activity slowed, but Hopkins continued with winning teams, already boasting 14 championships. 3 Hopkins lacrosse players lost their lives in the First World War, and they are still remembered today.
The greatest tradition that Johns Hopkins has had over the years is at the beginning of the first game each year, they hang flags on the back of the goals that have stars on them that represent the number of Hopkins alumni that have died during the various wars.
Placement of these flags on the goals remains one of the greatest symbols in Hopkins lacrosse. During the Roaring '20s, lacrosse flourished among Northeastern colleges and also at Hopkins. Lacrosse became the #1 sport on campus.
Oh, it was a big game. Lacrosse was everything at Hopkins, you know. That was a big sport. No matter what else was going on, everybody talked lacrosse. That's all they talked, you know.
Hopkins took 2 more championships in '23 and '24. Stressing technique and stick work, they became a high-caliber, experienced team.
The caliber was not in a class with today's present caliber, but it was pretty good as compared to other teams because of our stick work.
Doug Turnbull was the first player and one of only 3 in the history of the sport to receive first-team All-American honors in 4 consecutive years.
It was an attack stick, which permitted me to shoot a few goals with this stick, the same stick. Yeah, I love that stick. When you'd get hit with one of these, you knew you got hit, but it's a great stick full of catgut and rawhide.
Coach Ray Van Orman headed the Hopkins teams from 26 to 34, while Father Bill remained on the scene as assistant coach. Like so many Hopkins coaches, Van Orman had the uncanny ability of shaping good athletes into great lacrosse players. In 1926, his team outscored opponents more than 9-1.
Ray Van Orman was a great trainer of men. When they asked him to coach lacrosse, he learned a lot about it from Bill Smyser, and he and Bill stood close together during most of the games so that he got a great deal of help from Bill Smyser. But he took the full responsibility, something that Bill Smyser wanted him to do, and he did it very, very well.
Unknown to many, Van Orman had a dream of taking Hopkins to the Olympics. Fritz Studi recalls his first encounter with Van Orman.
And Ray Van Orman was in the stands watching. He's always looking for players, I guess. So at the half, he saw me playing basketball, and he came in the dressing room down at Loyola College. He says, "Hey, Studi," he says, you play lacrosse?" I says, "What's lacrosse?" He says, "Well, you know, Hopkins has lacrosse," and he says, "In a couple of years, they're going to the Olympics." That's how far ahead he was thinking.
In 1928, Calvin Coolidge was in the White House. The Roaring '20s were at their height, and lacrosse was introduced to the world as a demonstration sport at the Olympic Games in Amsterdam. 6 American teams competed in the U.S. qualifying playoffs, and the Mount Washington Lacrosse Club, an undefeated lacrosse powerhouse consisting of former Hopkins graduates and several All-Americans, was heavily favored to make the trip to Amsterdam. Hopkins was seeded last in the qualifying tournament, but they ousted Mount Washington, Army, and the University of Maryland to realize Van Orman's dream and earn the right to represent the United States. Proudly carrying their crosses, the Hopkins team crowded aboard the SS Roosevelt among the 238 American athletes and headed for the Olympic Games in Amsterdam. The United States, England, and Canada fought brilliantly in the Games. The United States team squeaked past their rivals from Canada, but lost to England, causing a heated, deadlocked 3-way tie. By virtue of the number of goals scored, the United States was declared the winner. and Hopkins returned home the world champions. Back at home, the Hopkins team rolled on, yielding only 3 losses in 2 years, 30 and 31, and capturing the national championship. Among the close-knit 32 team was Jack Turnbull, the younger brother of Doug, and a powerful attack man considered to be the best player ever to play the game. In 1932, Los Angeles hosted the 10th Olympiad, and Johns Hopkins once again earned the right to represent the United States in the Olympic Games. The Australian and English teams failed to appear due to financial constraints, but the Canadians were eager to avenge their Olympic defeat of 28. 80,000 people, the greatest crowd who ever witnessed a lacrosse game, were on hand at the Los Angeles Coliseum to see the United States take 2 out of 3 games against the Canadians. Winning the Olympic title, Hopkins had reached the pinnacle of the lacrosse world.
I was the greatest goalkeeper that ever played goal in lacrosse, and I don't care who played. Always won. I didn't know what it was to lose. If we'd have lost, we'd have been crying the whole time, I guess. But we always won. Why is a sense of losing?
The pages of Olympic history were permanently closed. Lacrosse never again returned to the Olympic arena. Johns Hopkins had the leading team in the nation in 33 and 34, with Ray Van Orman continuing as head coach. Dr. Kelso Marl, the first of 3 generations to play lacrosse at Hopkins, took the top spot from Van Orman in 35 and coached the team for 12 years. Dr. Marl was a mathematics professor at Hopkins, and his attitude of precision carried over in his coaching style. With the assistance of defensive coach Gardner Maloney, Kelso Marl continued to build Hopkins' record. In 1937, the Hopkins team traveled to England. Traveling to many different areas around the world, the Hopkins teams were frequently ambassadors for the sport of lacrosse. In 1938, gate receipts were eliminated. Games were free. The teams of 39 and 40 were great teams, and under the instruction of Marl and Maloney, the Blue Jays of 1941 recorded one of the most astonishing seasons in their history, allowing only 11 goals in a 9-game season. Bud Kastner and Captain John Tolson were the leaders of that team.
But Homewood Field really has a great tradition for me. It was very fitting that the Hall of Fame, when it was first established, be at Homewood, because that, I think, is to my mind anyway, the cradle of lacrosse.
The trauma of World War II devastated the sheltered world of collegiate athletics. Lacrosse enthusiasm hit rock bottom in 1944. The only year in Hopkins' 110-year history that failed to produce a team. 7 more gold stars were stitched on the commemorative flags, honoring those veterans who died in the Second World War. Among those soldiers was Jack Turnbull, shot down in a bombing mission over Germany. In remembrance of him, the Jack Turnbull Memorial Trophy is awarded each year to the country's best college attackman. The end of the war brought a wave of athletes back to Homewood. Those players that had served in the armed forces were anxious to return to normal life.
But probably a third of the 1947 team were extensive World War II veterans that were coming back, and they were delighted to play, to get out of the atmosphere of the war.
Howdy Myers succeeded Kelso Marl as head coach in '46. The architect of this team, Myers came from St. Paul's School in Brooklynville, a literal mill of lacrosse talent that produced 7 consecutive state titles. Never losing a collegiate game, Myers built a dynasty at Hopkins that was never to be rivaled.
The biggest phrase for Howdy would be that he was way, way ahead of his time.
Myers' teams produced 41 All-Americans in only 3 years' time. And for those Hopkins War veterans, the noise of cheering fans was a welcome sound.
But for those 2 to 2.5 hours, it was really a big-time, noisy atmosphere, which was great. We loved it, particularly as those that have been in the service and all. It was kind of nice to come back to something like that.
The culmination of the post-war teams was the 1950 squad, remembered as one of the greatest teams in lacrosse history. Their contributions, both on the field and after graduation, left lasting impressions on the sport. Coached by Kelso Marl after Myers' departure for Hofstra, The team was laden with a disproportionate amount of talent that even encompassed Coach Morrow's son, Billy, the ball boy. Two of these players, Fred Smith and Wilson Fuster, took turns coaching the early 50s teams. Like so many players before them, these men remained on the scene as coaches, sharing their experience with new players.
One of the real strong points that's made Hopkins lacrosse so consistently good is the fact that they've selected some very, very good coaches over the years, some of whom have been great lacrosse players, some of whom have been very average lacrosse players. But they always had one tremendous quality, and that was a lot of integrity in dealing with their players and a real commitment to fundamentals.
No one personified those ideals more perfectly than a young man named Bob Scott. In the fashion of his 1950 teammates, Scott gave a great deal back to the university and the sport that he loved. Taking over the coaching reins in '54, Scott remained at the helm for 20 years.
He's so knowledgeable, and he's been around, he's so experienced, and yet he's got such a great way about him. And he's Hopkins. I mean, if Hopkins has a tradition, I think Bob Scott personifies it.
Scotty's teams would go on to be champions in over a third of all the years they played. His hard-nosed, practical attitude and emphasis on preparation made fundamentals the name of the game at Hopkins. The late 50s saw Scott's hard work come to fruition. Billy Morrow, once the young ball boy of the 50 team, had grown up. Together, he and Mickey Webster formed a dangerously potent attack unit, breaking innumerable scoring records and putting Hopkins on top once again.
It was a pretty enthusiastic group, and it was interesting to me because a lot of the graduate students and professors, as well as the students at Hopkins, got interested in the game and would come to all the games. So it really was something that united the university and brought all people from all walks of life together.
Taking their talents abroad in 1958, the Blue Jays toured England, winning all 8 games they played. Lacrosse was becoming more visible around the world, and in April of 1962, Jerry Schmidt became the first and only lacrosse player ever to grace the cover of Sports Illustrated. While student protests and the riots of the early 1960s were at a pitch, Navy's powerful teams stole the spotlight. But players like Jerry Pfeiffer and Jerry Schneidman helped keep Hopkins close on their heels.
On game day, you'd walk into the locker room and nobody would say a word to anyone. We could have been all during the week having lots of laughs, but on game day, there was a sense of purpose, a sense that we had to go out and win, that everyone expected us to win, and we expected to win.
The late 60s brought a surge of new talent. While controversy over the Vietnam War overshadowed life on campus, Hopkins teams kept blazing the record books, winning 4 straight championships. Joe Cowan led an attack unit that continually blew out opponents.
I think the greatest attribute you can have is speed and quickness. You can't teach it. You're either born with speed and quickness. You can develop other things. You can develop strength and endurance and all those other things that are obviously important, but you have to have that great speed, and obviously you have to have hand-eye coordination, which is critical. But speed is any great lacrosse player, I think, if you ever watched him, you'll find that he had great speed. So it's a tremendous, tremendous asset that you have to have, I believe.
The marks of progress were clearly evident in the period of the early 70s. The university finally opened its doors to women in the freshman class of 1970. At the same time the university was undergoing this reorganization, the game of lacrosse on campus was experiencing a few changes of its own. The NCAA created a tournament to alleviate the heated controversy regarding the declaration of a national champion. This elimination system was a welcome addition and has since become the annual showcase of the country's finest lacrosse. About this time, Hopkins abolished the separate freshman team, permitting students to play varsity all 4 years. The advent of the synthetic lacrosse stick was the most revolutionary change to affect the game. First emerging at the University of Virginia, the new sticks were lighter, more accurate and maneuverable than their heavy wooden counterparts.
And I used the first artificial lacrosse stick in a lacrosse game my junior year against Penn. And it was real top heavy, but I was convinced that that was where it was going to go. And a lot of people didn't like them, but I loved them, and it sure is a good thing we have them today. It's really helped the game along tremendously, it really has.
In a partial effort to promote the growth of their sport, Navy and Hopkins took their annual grudge match to Houston in '71 and settled the score under the roof of the Astrodome. Navy emerged the victor, and the game was successful in generating a great deal of intrigue for the 18,000 Texan fans, most of whom had little understanding of the strange physical spectacle called lacrosse. Although always close in the running, Hopkins failed to win the big one under the new tournament system. So in 1974, the stage was set as Bob Scott entered his 20th and final year as head coach. Rick Kowalchuk, an attackman who teamed with partner in crime Jack Thomas, was a member of that '74 team.
Well, basically, the previous 2 years, we went to the national championship finals. In 1972, we lost to Virginia 13-12. And then the following year, we took Maryland into double overtime and lost 10-9. So it seemed like we were bridesmaids 2 years in a row. It was Bob Scott's last year coaching. So I guess the little thing around the school was a win-one for Scotty. And it was an exciting year, it really was.
The '74 Hopkins team, that was Bobby Scott's last team, who was described to me by a newspaper reporter for the Sun, Cameron Snyder, when they lost to Virginia, as the worst team he'd seen Hopkins have in years. And they went on to win the NCAA championship.
Battling a season of critics who had low expectations for the squad at Hopkins, it was a special moment indeed as the team took their first NCAA national crown. For Coach Scott, after 20 years of coaching the Blue Jays, this was the perfect end to a great coaching career.
No, they have never referred to me as Father Bob. I haven't moved into that position, and you know, our teams did well when I coached, but I mean, sometimes that gets blown out of proportion too.
Now serving as athletic director, Mr. Scott has devoted more than 40 years of his life to the lacrosse program. His fatherly manner towards his players and staff has made him a lasting favorite.
He's just a wonderful human being. He's a great inspiration to me, and I think to the kids who go here, and he just cares so much about it. And it's a big reason why Johns Hopkins really believes that lacrosse is so important, is because of Bob Scott.
To say Scott's replacement would have big shoes to fill is an understatement. There was, however, no one more perfect as a successor than Henry Ciccarone, one of the fieriest coaches to ever arrive on the scene at Hopkins. Chick's aggressiveness and charismatic coaching style produced 3 consecutive national championships.
Okay, Hopkins starting out in a 2-2-2, rotates into a 2-3-1. They now cut to 4 men across the crease, 1 man out top and 1 man behind. A great dodge by Brendan Schneck, shot and score.
Mike Burnett offside, he tripped over the line, so to speak, coming up, and Hopkins will have an advantage if they don't score here. Cook feeds inside. The shot by
The father of a family of athletes, Chick's intensity was awe-inspiring, while his rapport with players caused him to be a powerfully respected man on and off the field.
Well, Chick was a terrific competitor with an intensity on the sidelines that was almost frightening.
Chick was the competitor's competitor. I've never seen anybody that could will a win or will a victory like he could. He was the most organized, most intense, fastidious coach I've ever seen. He had it down to every detail. And in terms of his commitment, his desire, and his drive, he was second to no one.
Bursting onto the scene behind Ciccarone was Don Zimmerman, accepting the coaching responsibility in '84. Zim became the heir of an exceptional group of talent.
Here's Wilkins on the right. Ladoyan again. Score! Larry Ladoyan, the extra man goal. And
there goes Brian Wood against Mike O'Donnell. Wood moves in and scores!
At Hopkins, lacrosse is the sport, and you feel it when you walk around campus. I mean, you feel like, you know, everybody's waiting for spring, waiting for lacrosse to start.
For Hopkins, to Steve Mitchell on a break for the Blue Jays. They've got the lead and now the momentum. There's Wood circling in. Goal! 3 goals for Brian Wood, and Johns Hopkins has taken a 3-0 lead.
Brian Wood, the freshman, rewriting the history books right here. And this is...
I believe the reason they do it is because they want to play lacrosse at the highest level it can be played. So, as a coach, when I would recruit, I would look for those same characteristics in players that I had. You know, I wanted players that loved lacrosse and that would understand the commitment and the sacrifice and the dedication and the intensity that I had, and that would have the same desire to win, that burning desire to win. And that's the key.
Zimmerman's youthful determination produced 3 championships in his years as head coach.
they have 3 seconds to put the ball in the net. If they don't, the Blue Jays are the champs. Chalk up another national title for the Johns Hopkins Blue Jays.
The presence of other teams, though, never became more threatening than in the 80s, when Syracuse and North Carolina developed into national powerhouses.
There they do. They want to put it in the hands of Gates, and it's Gates against Petramala. That's your best matchup.
Petramala, he strips him of the ball, but Gates, does he have the presence of mind to get it? It's still loose. 27 seconds left. Looks like a face-off.
And, you know, the one thing that they said to me was, you'll have a chance at a national championship ring, if not one, many. And, you know, I can leave here saying that, you know, that was, the truth was told to me. I have a ring, and I played in another one. And I don't think a lot of schools can do that, can guarantee you to be in a national championship.
The tradition and the reputation that surrounds the program at Hopkins has provided an opportunity to serve as an ambassador of the sport in regions of the world where lacrosse is relatively unknown.
The lacrosse team from Hopkins has been to Japan, has worked with the government in helping to spread the game and giving clinics and so forth. Every 4 years, Hopkins, as a varsity team, takes an international trip.
We've virtually, introduced the game to Japan, and the Japanese have responded very well. And I think that's a contribution that we've made to lacrosse. Whether we'll also be successful in introducing it in Europe remains to be seen.
So many men at Hopkins and other schools have left their mark on the game of lacrosse that their names are countless. Like the DiMaggios and the Babe Ruths of baseball, these men are legendary heroes to generations of youngsters growing up in neighborhoods of cities like Baltimore. As the years pass and the names change, the recollections of their times and achievements still burn bright in the memories of us all.
You know, as you get older, you think back and you remember things that happened years ago, but maybe you can't remember what happened yesterday. But when I think back, I think my years at Hopkins and playing lacrosse were one of the happiest times of my life.
That was the Army Tabernacle Choir. Next, we'll be hearing the true story of an American housewife who claims to have taken mid-air photographs of Jesus Christ in the skies over Indiana.
High above the street stars is Mrs. Meatabottle, with one hand on the volume and one hand on the bottle. Somewhere over Indiana, 8 miles high, Meatabottle sees the good Lord wandering across the sky. Fabulous!
it's been awfully important to me. It's been a big part of my life, starting from age 3 or whenever it was I first went out to Homewood Field.
So if you walk around Baltimore and you see everybody with young kids with lacrosse sticks in your hands, you know what that means. They're just into the sport, and they've been bitten by the bug. So it's been an awful good memory for me.
I'm a pretty lucky person, and I've always felt that way, and this is the greatest job that anybody could ever have.
Extracting from the aisle a certain Mr. Beale, watching you, watching us, watching Mrs. Meet a Battle.
Having fun whilst you're alive.
All the same people came until they dropped dead. You bet they loved lacrosse and kept coming like I do at age 87.
How old were you when you first picked up a lacrosse stick?
I got my first lacrosse stick when I was 6 years old, and I'll never forget it. My father bought it for me.
I guess 10 years old or 9 years old, and that's where I picked it up the first time.
As different than a lot of people who play the game, I was at the age of 19 when I picked up my first lacrosse stick.
I must have been about 15 years old.
Probably 1.
I was about 5 years old. 7 years old.
My first time I picked up a lacrosse stick was in 9th grade.
That was in 1925. But I didn't know what lacrosse was. I said, what in the hell is that?
7th grade.
Well, I became president when I was 44, so 44, 45, just in there.
I first started with the game of lacrosse when I was in junior high school.
I would say I started playing early 10, 11, 12 was the first time I really started playing lacrosse.
It was as a 9th grader, so I guess I was age 14 at the time.
I was walking down to try out for my college baseball team in my freshman year. I had never seen lacrosse. I stopped and watched practice, and I went, this is the greatest game I ever saw in my life. After 10 minutes, the glove went over one shoulder, the spikes went over the other, and I went and asked the coach if I could try out, and he said yes. That started my lacrosse career at Cortland State, 1961. Never forget it.
Hi, I'm Steve Stenerson. We at the Lacrosse Foundation invite you to learn more about the sport of lacrosse. Please stop by and visit the new Lacrosse Hall of Fame Museum in Baltimore. And for more information about lacrosse programs or locating lacrosse teams in your area, please contact us at 113 West University Parkway, Baltimore, Maryland, 21210, or phone us at area code 410-235-6882. Get involved in America's fastest growing team sport.